Hello, everyone. Hope you're hanging in there, keeping safe. This will be the first of 2 video lectures this week, recording this on Wednesday, April 1st, for your reference. So let me begin the presentation. Okay, so we're going to wrap up with a few things from last time and then start to move into some new topics. So first, some things came up in our discussion last time with regard to the stereotype content model of social cognition, which looked at how we make judgments, evaluative judgments of other people based on warmth and competence. And there was one study I found, and in all these slides, I've linked out to the study. So I have the study's authors and year here indicated in yellow. So if you want to learn about these studies, you can follow these links. So someone asked whether there are cultural differences in the stereotype content model. So it's an interesting kind of answer to the question, at least according to this study by Cuddy and others, that warmth and competence are indeed underlying dimensions for evaluation, and this is true across cultures, but the specific content of stereotypes and how in-groups are defined, that varies, and that depends on cultural differences. So the simple answer here, although there's a lot of nuance in this study that looks at these cultural differences, but the simple answer is that overall, yes, there are underlying dimensions of warmth and competence that all cultures follow, but then the specifics with regards to certain stereotypes, that's culturally determined, and that will vary from, let's say, individualistic to collectivistic cultures, for example. With regards to perceiving faces and inferring traits about others, there was a study that showed some gender effects such that for both male and female participants, when they made judgments about faces that were presented to them, computer-generated faces, the faces that were counter-stereotypical for females, so if it was like a more masculine or dominant-looking female face, those faces were perceived more negatively than stereotypical female or male faces. So this indicates, and this was true for both male and female participants, so this indicates there might be some differences with regard to how gender interacts with, aspects of a face to determine a judgment. And with regards to age effects, this study here by Caulfield and others showed that the ability to evaluate trustworthiness of faces actually emerges in childhood. So younger children are able to do this and able to pick up on the trustworthiness of faces. But that ability doesn't match kind of adults' ability until children are about 10 years of age. So they can do it a little bit younger, but it takes about 10 years of development before children can kind of do this with equal ability to that of adults. And then emotion cues, so faces have certain emotional expressions that will also move around trustworthiness judgments. So I just wanted to offer these studies to you. If they're of interest, feel free to follow the links. I just wanted to provide that to you. And then one last study, which I believe is pretty interesting, is that this study had participants look at faces that varied in race and also status. And then they asked participants to make a judgment of what race is this particular face. So they showed them many different faces that had different combinations of status, high and low status, and features in a face that would lead to perception of a white face or a black face. So here are some of the representative faces from this study, and you can see going from left to right, you have stereotypically white or black faces, but then you also have hold on one second here. Sorry. Okay. It's not working, but I'm going to keep going. So here you had faces that varied as far as whether they appeared more stereotypically white or black, but then they also had different types of clothing on, indicating high status is indicated by a suit, or low status, kind of a blue kind of general work garb. And interestingly, the faces that were neutral as far as whether they were considered white or black faces, the faces here in the center indicated by kind of the neutral point of that scale, the faces that had that were part of a body that had a suit on, those faces were rated more likely to be white, whereas the faces that had the blue work outfit on, even though the face is the same, the bottom face there was more likely to be rated as black. So that was a study that showed that people rely on different cues, and that social status, or cues that indicate social status, can influence race perception. Then lastly, with regards to trustworthiness and attractiveness judgments, this was another question that came up. And the relationship, the question is, if someone finds a face trustworthy, do they also find the face attractive, etc.? And there are kind of two things at play here. One is a really important phenomenon with regards to social perception, and even when judging faces, perceiving faces. It's known as the halo effect. So this is when positive and negative perceptions and judgments co-vary and cut across evaluative dimensions, so that if you judge a face to be really trustworthy, you're more likely to judge it to be attractive, and vice versa. That this kind of halo or glow, positive or negative glow or judgment that you imbue in your perception, like that will hold across dimensions. So even though trustworthiness and attractiveness are separate constructs, separate dimensions, it could very well be that if you rate a face to be highly trustworthy, you're likely to also rate that face as highly attractive according to the halo effect. And then in the textbook, Ward mentions a study where a face was morphed to appear and look more like the participant's own face, and you had a divergence here a little bit of trustworthiness judgments and attractiveness judgments, so that those faces that looked more like the participants' own faces, participants rated them as more trustworthy, but also less attractive, which could indicate an evolutionary mechanism against incest. So that would obviously prevent genetic abnormalities from propagating generation to generation. So the idea would be it would be adaptive to maybe trust those who might look like you or from your tribe, etc. But of course, you wouldn't want to have find members of your own family, especially your immediate family, attractive from an evolutionary point of view. So those are just some follow-up studies and things I wanted to tie up before we change gears this week. And then also for tomorrow, which is April 2nd, for our virtual meeting, we're going to discuss some of the Data Blitz presentations, where we'll talk a little bit about each group's presentation and kind of the takeaway from each study. There were a lot of interesting studies that were looked at, so I think that'll be fun, hopefully, and interesting. And then, of course, if there are any topics or things that come up from this lecture, be happy to discuss them further and review them with you. And then later this week, I'm going to post on Google Classroom an assignment known as a reflective walking assignment. I'll give you more instructions and details about that. But basically, you will kind of take some time to think about one of these questions listed here, or you can choose your own question with regards to theory of mind or empathy, which we're learning about this week. And you're going to go on a walk without any devices or anything to distract you. Just go on a long walk, kind of think about these questions, and then when you come back from your walk, you'll kind of jot down things that have come to mind, and I'll give you more specific instructions. So that's kind of where we're going this week. And of course, this is the first video lecture that I'll post this week, but there'll be another one coming up as well. So this week, we're going to continue on our journey through the social brain, how we build a social brain. And we're going to talk about a very important topic today, and then next time for the next lecture. Today we'll be talking about mentalizing and theory of mind. So we will first kind of learn some general concepts and just our general tendencies as human beings to mentalize about other agents. And you can think, like, as we learn about these processes, we're now moving away from just mere perception and recognition to more nuanced inference and prediction about what other people are doing, right? Because in our social worlds, we have a lot of information that our brains have to sort through, and we have to be accurate, hopefully, and good at inferring and predicting what another person is going to do. For example, if someone's going to harm me or help me, and just gauging our interactions. So these are really important core processes in social psychology, but certainly in social neuroscience as well. And we'll also learn about some of the neural correlates. We're going to talk about one process or one concept called theory of mind, and we'll kind of talk a little bit about whether theory of mind in the brain is instantiated in a way, whether it's domain general, more domain specific. And this just recapitulates a theme that's been recurring this semester with regard to how does the brain kind of represent these processes? Are there specific separable modules in the brain that support these processes, or do different brain regions kind of work together, and it's their collective effort and how they are active and coactive together that gives rise to the social phenomena, these social cognitive processes. And then lastly, I'll talk just a little bit in brief, because I could go much. There's a lot more, but we just don't have the time. But we'll talk a little bit about theory of mind deficits and autism spectrum disorder, and whether this is kind of a sort of mind blindness, so to speak. That's kind of a colloquial or philosophical way to think about it. So this is what we're going to go through today for this video. We'll start with mentalizing. Now, mentalizing, just from kind of a broad definition, is attributing or inferring the hidden mental states of others. Now, namely and often, this is other human beings. Now, it could be other non-human animals as well, but for the purpose of kind of our class and what we're learning about, we're really only talking about mentalizing when it comes to inferring or attributing mental states to other human beings. And the one reason I put hidden in parentheses and I included it in the definition is that's really important, because it's quite a trick and quite a feat for us anytime to try to guess what someone is thinking, what they're feeling, what they're intending to do, right? Their mind is completely inaccessible to us, and we have to make our best guesses about what someone is thinking, what they're about to do, or what they may do in the future. It'll impact us, it might impact others. So mentalizing is such a core feature of our social kind of cognitive equipment. And therefore, the brain needs structures to help us accomplish this, and we'll be learning about this. So from a very kind of broad level, mentalizing is this overall idea of attributing or inferring mental states to others. And those mental states could be thoughts, beliefs, feelings, desires, intentions to act, all of the above. And this is this is very much part and parcel to being human. We take it for granted, we do it automatically. And you can think about it as detecting not only signal in the noise, amidst the noise kind of in our environments, but detecting agentic signal, right? That there's something in our environment, right, that has a will, that has intentions, that is its own agent, and it may interact with me, right? So we have to be able to detect this. And the thing is, our minds are really good at detecting faces and detecting other things in our environment that could signal, okay, something may have a mind of its own and may be interacting with me. So it's so automatic, it's so powerful that we don't really have to learn how to do it. It just develops naturally, especially early on in development, in the first few years of life. We develop this ability to infer the mental states of other people and look at our environment and kind of scan it for other people and what they may be intending to do. And an early example, and this is so prevalent that we end up anthropomorphizing a lot of things, including seeing faces that aren't really there, that don't correspond to biological organisms. But then here, this was an early demonstration of this by Heider and Simmel in 1944. So I'd encourage you to pause this video now for just a minute or two and check out this video. And then when you're done, come on back and we'll talk about it. Welcome back. Hopefully you enjoyed that video. Now, if you're like most people who view this little animation, you probably found it relatively easy to ascribe intentions to these little geometric shapes, right? You probably thought of different words and concepts of, blocking or protecting or encouraging that all have to do with what agents do, what biological organisms, ourselves, how we interact with the world, how we kind of exercise our agency when we interact with other people. But we do this automatically, and we know full well that these geometric shapes are not people. They're not biological organisms with a mind. However, our brains just see it, and it's quite automatic to ascribe these intentions and these abilities to even things that are not human. So so we've talked at this point, up until this point, very generally about mentalizing, how we mentalize about other people, other agents, right? But we're going to talk about a more specific aspect of mentalizing known as theory of mind, and we'll talk a little bit also about its neural correlates. So theory of mind, there are many ways to define it, but one that I just have come up with that's hopefully helpful. It's an internal mental model that assumes that other people have intentions, beliefs, desires that diverge from our own, and that's really key. Because with a theory of mind, it's not just an awareness of your own mind and your own intentions and beliefs, desires, etc. But it's also this kind of working model where you say, oh, other people have minds too, and they are going to believe, intend, and feel and think things that might be the same as me, but most of the time, these things will diverge, right? And we need a way, cognitively and neurally to represent this kind of disconnect, right? That this other mind is going to think and feel and do its own thing, and I have my own mind, which is going to think and feel and do its own thing. But we need a way to represent these two, at least two. I mean, if there are more people, there's even more to represent, right? But here, I was just kind of thinking of one mind and one other mind. So another aspect of theory of mind, which is important, are these repeated nested levels of intentionality, such as second-order intentionality in false belief tasks. Now, in the textbook, Ward talks about a very famous false belief task called the Sally Ann task, colloquially. And the idea is that, and this is shown to children at different stages of development to see how their theory of mind develops over time. So in the first panel, you have Sally and Ann. Sally places her marble in the basket, and Ann is sitting off to the side, and there's a box. Sally leaves in the second panel. Then the key thing that happens is in the third panel, where Ann takes the marble, removes it from the basket, and places it in the box. And all of this, of course, is happening while Sally is not in the picture. She doesn't know this is happening. Then in the last panel, panel 4, Sally comes back, and then the key kind of outcome measure here is how do people respond to the question, where will Sally look for her marble? Will she look in the basket or will she look in the box? Now, for very, very young children who haven't developed a complete theory of mind, they will only rely on their own egocentric perspective, what they know, what they've seen. So, oh, Sally comes back, she'll look in the box, right? Because that's what the child just saw, saw that that's where the marble is now. But as children get a little bit older, and it doesn't take them long to do this really, they'll say, oh, wait, Sally will actually look in the basket because Sally thinks the marble is still in the basket. And this is second order intentionality, right? That you not only have beliefs about your own mind, but you have beliefs about others' beliefs. I believe that she believes this, right? So it's this kind of iterative kind of nesting of how we represent our mind and others' minds. So this is kind of a canonical but hopefully straightforward example of theory of mind in action. And there have been many studies about this, but I just picked this one from the textbook that's I find interesting. Just given that it emphasizes the automaticity of theory of mind and how we engage in perspective taking. So here they had participants count the number of dots in this little simulated room, and then report on the number of dots, either from their own perspective or the person depicted in this simulated kind of mock room. And the task was participants report the number of dots. And the two independent variables here, they asked participants to either report from the perspective of themselves, so an egocentric perspective, or that of the other person in the image. And then also they asked, they also varied the number of dots, right? Because that would lead to consistent or inconsistent perspectives. And what they found is that participants were slower to respond during the inconsistent condition, even when reporting from their own egocentric perspective. So this means that, for example, when they had to report just what they were seeing, if they saw themselves 2 dots, but they knew that the person would only see one of the dots, they would still take a little bit more time, because the authors here interpret that, okay, the participants are trying to take the perspective of the other person, and then that process is happening relatively automatically. So the moral of this story, the takeaway here is that theory of mind is very enmeshed with and relates to perspective taking, and this is a relatively automatic process for many of us. And I just want to take a pause here and kind of survey the space of relevant constructs that we'll be talking about this week. So like I said, perspective taking and theory of mind are very much overlapping, and then these constructs and processes live in this 2-dimensional space where either these processes are directed more toward the self or about the self, or they're more directed towards other people. And then these processes either have more kind of cognitive features, like higher order kind of controlled processes that take a little bit more kind of cognitive work, and that's on the upper end here of the y-axis. But then you also have more affective or emotionally laden processes. So this week we're going to primarily be talking about, well, you see mentalizing is that gray circle that kind of encompasses everything, right? It's latent, it's part of this whole space. But today we're talking primarily about perspective taking and theory of mind. That's directed toward other people, but it's a little bit more cognitive in nature. And in the next video, we'll be talking more about empathy. So in this video, we're talking about these more cognitive processes directed towards other people that helps us mentalize and simulate what another person is experiencing. And then we're going to talk next time a little bit about empathy. Okay, but what about the neural correlates of theory of mind, right? How does the brain help us establish a theory of mind? How does the brain help us mentalize in the first place? So there are 3 key regions. The first region, and here I have the boxes with the names of the regions and their function overlaid on where they are in the brain, more or less. So first you have the temporal poles. So it's the end of the temporal lobe kind of going anteriorly. And the temporal poles are not so much domain specific when it comes to social cognition, but they're important for social cognition, such that temporal poles help us retrieve and process conceptual and semantic knowledge. They're kind of like a store of knowledge for us, for socially related concepts and kind of the semantic, the aspects of meaning when it comes to social behavior. So that's really important. And then you have another region that's been studied a lot when it comes to theory of mind, and it's known as the temporal parietal junction, or the TPJ. And the shorthand, as far as the function of this region that I'm using, is the detection of agents in motion. So the TPJ cares a lot about anything in your environment that is biologically relevant, like another creature, another organism moving, but not just a creature moving, willy-nilly, but a creature or an organism that is moving with intent, right? That is reaching for you or reaching for something or walking to grab the door or something like that, right? Your TPJ is going to pick up on that because it is helping you process this biological motion, but it's agentic. The motion is agentic. It's the motion or the action is being done by an organism that has a will, that has an intention behind their action. So that's the second region. The last region, really importantly, is the medial prefrontal cortex. And it was hard for me to kind of come up with a concise summary of what the MPFC is doing because it's not always clear. But it's at the very least, we know it's very important for social cognition. The MPFC helps us construct representations of socially relevant contexts. Any context in which we find ourselves where our mind and or other minds are present. And then given that, we have possible beliefs and goal states and intentions, right? And that's a special kind of context. We're not always in that context, right? We might be interacting with objects that don't have a mind, so our MPFC is not going to care about that as much. But if we're interacting with someone, or if we see someone from across the way, and we're like, do we know that person, or what are they doing, or whatever, your MPFC is going to come online and help you process that kind of social context. And you may remember with regards to MPFC that this slide was from a previous lecture, but it just shows you the kinds of studies that have reliably activated the MPFC, whether it's mentalizing or animations kind of showing social movements, trait inferences, person knowledge, social scenes, etc. So all of these things activate the MPFC and are important with regards to social cognition. So we've kind of covered theory of mind, and then three, they're not the only three, but they're the three most important neural correlates of theory of mind: the temporal poles, temporal parietal junction, or TPJ, and the medial prefrontal cortex, or MPFC, right? So these are three regions that are really, really important for theory of mind, and they all kind of work together, right? So you could be thinking about that when it comes to the question of, is mentalizing, is there a mentalizing module in the brain? Probably not, but maybe there are cases you can make for that, or not. But it's clearly, the evidence is not definitive yet. It's not like there's definitely been something discovered that, oh, here is the module, or no, like regions don't have any kind of specific role to play in social cognition. So let's conclude today's video with talking about one diagnostic kind of dimension in the DSM known as autism spectrum disorder. And before we go into this, I should say, even though I'm not trained in clinical psychology, but it's fair to say that autism spectrum disorder is, it's one diagnostic category. However, people who are diagnosed with ASD can vary a lot in terms of their symptoms and their levels of social functioning. So you have relatively high, relatively low functioning individuals who all share the ASD diagnosis from the DSM. But as far as how they interact with other people, their kind of social functioning, generally speaking, with their language ability, all of these things vary a ton. So it's almost hard to make a broad sweeping kind of comparison between people who have ASD and then people who do not have that diagnosis. However, there is one study we'll be talking about looking at connectivity in the brain that may begin to shed light on some underlying aspects of ASD, and that can account for these observed symptoms. So Ward in your textbook lays out various theories and accounts for autism, where autism spectrum disorder can be considered as mind blindness and just this inability to mentalize. You can't represent, individuals with ASD cannot really represent their own mind and the mind of other people. So you have this mind blindness. You can't mentalize well. You can't simulate what the other person is thinking. Another theory that's been thrown out there is that autism spectrum disorder is primarily one of dysfunction with regards to executive functioning. So this refers to the inability to use higher order processes to integrate complex social stimuli and information. Another theory that's been thrown out there is known as weak central coherence, that for whatever reason, people with ASD have, they focus a lot on specific features and parts of objects and things they encounter, rather than kind of putting it all together into a cohere like whole. So that's another theory. Another one is an extreme form of what's called the male brain, and this distinction has to do with systemizing things versus empathizing. That's another one. And yet another one is the broken mirror theory of autism. And this speaks to individuals who have ASD, that they don't have the ability to simulate what another person is thinking, because they can't really represent their own mind as well, and they can't make that connection. So these are various accounts, and there's some evidence for all of them. So it's kind of murky if you look at the current evidence, and then that's where the field is right now. This is a really important area of study in social neuroscience and in clinical psychology, generally speaking. So if any of you are interested in studying this further for your independent research here at Bard or down the road, it could potentially be quite fruitful, because a lot still needs to be discovered and figured out. But I'll offer kind of one study that looks at brain connectivity that might shed a little light here. And this was one by DiMartino and others. And what I like about this study is that they tested many people, where they had over 500 individuals who were diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. And then they had about the same number of people who were kind of, they're called the typical controls, like where they're matched on a lot of other features. But the main difference here between the two groups is that in the typical controls group, they don't have an ASD diagnosis. So here in this graph, depicted by these kind of spheres and these connections between them, these are all patterns of functional connectivity. So this refers to whether a brain region is active, and then if a brain region is active and another brain region is active, and they're kind of in sync with one another functionally, that would mean that you see more connections between those regions, where you have a line drawn between them. So these are not anatomical connections. These are not, tracks of white matter that are connecting these different brain regions. Rather, it's their functional connectivity. So if one brain region is tracking with another, you have increased functional connectivity, and you have those lines drawn between the different regions. And in the top panel, where you look at where connections are greater for the typical controls versus the ASD group, you have a lot of connections. So overall, there's a lot more connectivity in the brain for typical controls versus the ASD group. But in the bottom panel, it's just kind of, it's the converse, right? So where are connections more strong, where there are stronger connections for the autism spectrum disorder group, the ASD group, compared to the typical controls. And you'll see there aren't too many differences there, but there are some connections depicted in red here with some regions. But what I want to highlight for you is that you'll notice that compared to typical controls, you actually have lack of connectivity in three regions that we were just talking about, right? On the left there, you have the temporal poles in the lower part, and then the temporal parietal junction, and then in the middle brain on the bottom row, you have areas of medial prefrontal cortex. So these regions are not really connected to or talking to other regions and other parts of the brain. Whereas you have a lot of dense connections with more subcortical regions and regions in the basal ganglia that help us kind of perform movements and kind of repeat actions. So that could be a reason why in autism spectrum disorder you have stereotypical repeated actions, where a person may repeat the same thing over and over again, or they may be fixated on something because it could be that their basal ganglia or that part of the brain is really well connected, whereas these other parts of the brain that are important for mentalizing and theory of mind are not connected to the rest of the brain. So information is not being kind of conveyed and not integrated as well. as those who don't have the ASD diagnosis. So this is just one study. It's a more recent study. It's very well powered, obviously, because the sample sizes are large. So this is kind of a first stab at understanding whole brain differences in individuals with ASD versus typical controls. And yeah, so I just wanted to offer that to you. And with that, that's it for now. And we'll pick up in the next video looking at empathy. So until then, be well, and see you soon.